Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Pooja Thakur. I'm the Communications Planner for Elections Calgary, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today to learn about third-party advertising during the 2021 general election. Today's session is a presentation given by Andrew Brower, Deputy City Clerk with Elections Calgary. You may use the chat to pose a question at any time during the session. You have the option to submit your question with your name or do so anonymously. Third-party advertising is a newly regulated activity in the election process. In order to allow time to confirm questions raised with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and the city's legal team, if required, answers will not be provided at today's session. However, answers will be shared on the Elections Calgary website. We will compile all of the questions raised today and post them online in a few weeks. If you sign up to the Elections Calgary e-newsletter, you'll receive notice when the answers have been posted. And I'll show you where to sign up for the e-newsletter at the end of today's session. The session is being recorded. The presentation and all future information sessions will be posted to the Elections Calgary YouTube channel and website. And as with any technology, we appreciate your patience and ask that you bear with us if we experience any glitches. We will also be sending out a survey after the sessions are over for feedback so that we can improve future events. I will now pass this over to Andrew Brower, Deputy City Clerk with Elections Calgary.
Thank you, Pooja. If I could just have one of my team members indicate if everyone can hear me okay. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Okay, thank you, Pooja. And thanks to everyone for joining today's presentation. The presentation will highlight the foundations of third-party provisions in the Local Authorities Elections Act, or the LAEA for short, including the definition of a third-party advertiser, what constitutes election advertising, how to register as a third-party advertiser, expense and contribution considerations, disclosures, and post-election requirements. Throughout the presentation, I may refer to third-party advertisers as TPAs for short. TPAs and candidates are accountable for their responsibilities under the legislation and must ensure they satisfy their obligations. The information in today's session is provided for convenience of reference only. And before I proceed, I'll mention that much of the presentation I'll cover today, or the information in the presentation I'll cover today, is available on our website, electionscalgary.ca. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to start with a recap of what voters can expect to see on their ballot. The general election will include mayoral, councillor, and school board trustee candidates. Council may also include questions for voters to consider. So currently, Council has directed the question, are you in favor of reintroducing fluoridation of the municipal water supply? So it's anticipated that a Senate election and various provincial referendum questions will be directed by the province and added to the ballot for the October 18th election. Next slide. The current rules regulating third-party advertising came into effect on September the 1st, 2020, and that was part of the Bill 29 amendments to the LAEA. As a result, the October 18th, 2021 general election will be the first election where TPAs are regulated. This session may be of interest to registered TPAs, prospective TPAs, and candidates. TPAs and candidates should carefully review their obligations in the LAEA, but I'll draw specific attention to Section 166. This section states that a TPA cannot collude with a candidate to circumvent or attempt to circumvent a contribution or expense limit where applicable. Similarly, a candidate cannot collude with a TPA to circumvent or attempt to circumvent a contribution or expense limit where applicable. This means that third-party advertising is separate from a candidate's campaign and must be done independently from the candidate. Any advertisements or materials that are made and distributed by a candidate or under a candidate's direction are part of the candidate's campaign. So third-party advertising is a way for those outside the candidate's campaign to express support of or opposition to candidates and to try to persuade voters to vote a certain way. The LAEA prescribes who a third party is, what constitutes election advertising, when to register, and who to register with. Next slide. So who is a third party in the context of the LAEA? A third party may be an individual, corporation, or group. A group may include an unincorporated group of individuals or corporations acting together for a common purpose and includes a trade union and an employee organization, or a combination of individuals, corporations, trade unions, or employee organizations. Individuals must reside in Alberta, and corporations, trade unions, or employee organizations must operate in Alberta. So a third party does not include candidates or individuals who reside outside of Alberta. Registered charities, corporations, or groups which do not operate in Alberta are not considered third parties regulated by the LAEA. Next slide. So how does the LAEA define election advertising itself? Election advertising includes an advertising message that promotes or opposes the election of a candidate during an election advertising period. The election advertising period starts on May the 1st in the year of a general election and runs until the end of election day. So for this election, 2021, the advertising period begins on May the 1st, 2021 and ends on October the 18th, 2021. Next slide. So to elaborate, some examples of election advertising, and I've shown these on the slide. They might include TV, radio, newspaper ads, signs, billboards and posters, newsletters, brochures, mailing inserts, ads on the internet with a placement cost, so that could be a pay-per-click or paid social media, pop-up ads, etc. It also includes activities such as canvassing and organizing events, but specifically where the primary purpose of the event is to promote or oppose a candidate. Okay, next slide. The LAEA, for further clarity, outlines a number of circumstances which do not constitute election advertising. So election advertising is not an editorial, a debate, a speech, an interview, a column, a letter, or commentary or news. It does not include the distribution, promotion, or sale of a book for less than its commercial value, a document or communication directly by a corporation or a group to its members, employees, or shareholders, transmissions of political views on the internet, telephone calls to electors encouraging them to vote, advertising by the local jurisdiction in any form, and by local jurisdiction I mean the City of Calgary, Elections Calgary, and the school boards, and unintended transmission in another jurisdiction. So I think the important point to make here too is Elections Calgary does not determine, we're not the arbiter of whether a particular type of advertising is considered third-party advertising that's regulated by the LAEA. TPAs are encouraged to carefully and fully review what constitutes election advertising in the Act, and if required, they should seek legal advice. Okay, next slide. So the LAEA requires election advertising to include 3 elements: the TPA's name, their contact information, and whether the third party authorized the election advertising. There are additionally some specific rules that apply to telephone advertising, and that could include live calls or automated pre-recorded calls. Sometimes those are called robocalls, and they include the requirement to have a call display. That is, the telephone number cannot be blocked, has to be visible. The name of the third party, that the message is authorized by the third party, and a contact number at the end of the advertising message. So it's similar to the printed advertisement requirements. Okay, next slide. So who should TPAs register with? If the TPA plans to advertise a message that opposes or supports a candidate in Calgary's general election, they should register with Elections Calgary. Where the TPA is planning to advertise a message that opposes or supports a candidate in 10 or more local jurisdictions, they should register with the provincial registrar. The provincial registrar's contact information is available on the Elections Calgary website. But in both cases, registration is required where the TPA has incurred or intends to incur expenses or receives or intends to receive contributions of at least $1,000. So again, it's where expenses or contributions exceed or plan to exceed $1,000. Next slide. So finally, a TPA should register with Elections Alberta if they plan to advertise related to a provincial issue or an entity such as members of the Legislative Assembly, provincial political parties, Alberta Senate election candidates, or provincial referendum questions. And I mentioned that we will have two ballots in this election, so TPAs associated with those provincial matters should register with Elections Alberta. Okay, next slide. So just to summarize, these questions I have on the slide here can be helpful in determining if a message should be or could be considered election advertising, and if the third party is required to register and with whom. So the first question is the third party a resident of Alberta? Are they a corporation or a group operating in Alberta? Is it election advertising? That is, will the message be transmitted to the public? Will it occur during the election advertising period, May 1st through Election Day? Will it promote or oppose a candidate? And then have contributions of at least $1,000 or expenses of $1,000 been incurred. So if the answer is to yes to those questions, the TPA would either register with Elections Calgary if they're planning on advertising in fewer than 10 local jurisdictions, or with the provincial registrar with 10 or more. And of course, if it's advertising, third-party advertising that's related to a provincial issue, as I mentioned, they would register with Elections Alberta. Okay, next slide. So in order to register with Elections Calgary, Form 27, that's registration of a third party, must be completed. This prescribed form requires a primary contact, the contact for the Chief Financial Officer or CFO, the location where records are maintained, and financial institution information for the TPA, including signing authorities. All of this information is contained on Form 27. If the TPA is a group, the registration must be accompanied by the name and contact information of principal officers or principal members. If the group has a governing body, sometimes, for example, a board of directors, the registration must include a resolution passed by the governing body authorizing advertising expenses. In order to comply with the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, Elections Calgary also requires the TPA to complete an information consent form, and that's to make the TPA's registration, contact, and disclosure information accessible to the public. If a third party changes their registration information, for example, they may change their name, they must notify Elections Calgary within 30 days of the change in writing, and that notification can occur by email. For access to Form 27 in the consent form, you can visit the Third Parties tab. For Third Parties tab, that's on electionscalgary.ca. Okay, next slide. So in the next few slides, I will provide a summary of TPA obligations regarding contributions, expenses, and disclosures. As I mentioned a few times here, you would want to review the LAEA for more specific requirements. So this is just a general summary. So as I indicated, TPAs must register where expenses or contributions exceed or intend to exceed $1,000. Election advertising donations can only be accepted from eligible contributors, and those include an individual resident of Alberta, a corporation, a trade union, or an employee organization operating in Alberta. So in contrast to that, ineligible contributors include an individual who is not resident in Alberta, a trade union or employee organization that does not operate in Alberta, a prohibited corporation, and that's as defined in the Election Finances and Contributions Disclosure Act, or EFCDA. And examples of prohibited corporations under the EFCDA is a municipality and a post-secondary institution. As well, an ineligible contributor includes a group where any member of the above, a group where any member is one of the above, rather, or a registered charity. Election advertising contributions must be deposited into the TPA's advertising account. Next slide. The LAEA requires the local jurisdiction to set out the requirements of a TPA contribution receipt. Receipts must include the date, the name and address of the contributor, the amount donated. Note that the type of receipts used, or the style of receipts, is not prescribed and is not issued or available from Elections Calgary. We're just concerned about the content of the actual receipt. Okay, next slide. So some further details regarding contributions. A contributor can donate to more than one TPA, but their total aggregate donations cannot exceed $30,000 during the advertising period. And remember, the advertising period is May the 1st through Election Day. So a simple example, an individual resident of Alberta contributes $10,000 to 3 registered TPAs between June and August of this year. So as a result, they have met their contribution limit. Where property, goods, or services are donated to a TPA for a price that is less than market value or free, the amount by which the value exceeds the price is considered an advertising contribution. So for example, web services of $700 are provided to a TPA. However, these services have a market value of $1,000. Therefore, the contribution to the TPA is $300. Amounts of $50 or less are not considered a contribution, but the TPA CFO is required to record the aggregate amount in the disclosure statement. Any anonymous contributions in excess of $50 must be returned to the donor. If the identity of the donor cannot be established, the funds must be paid to the City of Calgary. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned previously, registration with Elections Calgary is required where the TPA has or plans to incur expenses of $1,000 or more. TPAs are subject to any aggregate expense limit established by regulation. I should note that currently no such regulation exists. So just a few points on expenses. Volunteer labor is not considered an expense, provided the volunteer does not receive any compensation from their employer in doing their work or paid time off to volunteer. Expenses must be paid from the TPA's advertising account and authorized by the CFO. All expenses are recorded in the TPA's disclosure statement, which is due on March the 1st, 2022, and I'll cover that in the next slide. It's just a few rules regarding fundraising event ticket prices. So when a fundraising event ticket is $50 or less, up to half of the ticket value can be allowed for expenses. When the event ticket is between $50 and $100, $25 is allowed for expenses. And then when the event ticket is more than $100, 25% of the amount is allowed for expenses. So this gives some guidelines when planning, a TPA is planning fundraising events. Okay, next slide. So like candidates, TPAs are required to file disclosure statements by March the 1st, 2022. This includes a completed Form 28, which is called the Advertising Contribution Report, a financial statement, list of contributors and expenses, a list of the time and place of broadcast or publication of advertisements to which the election advertising expenses relate, and any supporting documents. Form 28 is under development and will be posted on the Elections Calgary website. All TPAs and candidates will be advised when this is posted by way of the Elections Calgary Elections Calgary e-newsletter. TPAs should ensure they retain their records for 3 years following the filing deadline. And so that filing, 3 years from the filing deadline is March the 1st, 2025. Okay, next slide. So this slide hopefully is helpful in comparing the requirements of candidates and third parties for some of the key areas that we've been talking about here. So I'm going to just pause for a few minutes to allow you the opportunity to review the slide, and then I'll just do a quick summary of that. Okay, so with regard to eligible contributors, a candidate, the contributor can only be an individual who is ordinarily resident in Alberta. They have to be an Alberta resident. A third party, in terms of its contributors, They can be an individual resident in Alberta or a corporation, trade union, employee organization, and groups operating in Alberta. The contribution limits with respect to a candidate, $5,000 per candidate and $10,000 in self-contributions. With regard to the third party, it's $30,000 per contributor in total. The expense limits for both the candidate and the third party are subject to a regulation, and currently there are no expense limits set by regulation for either the candidate or the third party. Regarding the disclosure of the name and address of contributors, for candidates, it would occur where those contributions exceed $50, and for the third party, where those contributions for election advertising exceeds $250. The disclosure statements are both for the candidate and the third party are due March the 1st, 2022. Just to note that the disclosure statement for the candidate is called Form 26, and as we mentioned, it is Form 28 with regard to third party. The surplus carryover requirement, surpluses in amounts above $999.99 must be donated to a registered charity, and that is then recorded in a disclosure statement. And with regard to third parties that can be carried over to the next election, it can be carried over to the next election, but it must be disposed of within 6 months after. With regard to enforcement, which I'll cover in a couple of slides, both the candidate and the third party, the election commissioner is accountable for the enforcement of the finance provisions and for all aspects of the third parties. So I'll cover that in the next slide. Okay, in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So with regard to canceling registration, a registration may be canceled with a third party's written application to Elections Calgary or the provincial registrar if applicable. TPA's registration will also be cancelled if the CFO of the third party fails to file an election advertising return or fails to report election advertising contributions received during the advertising period. If the registration of a third party is cancelled and the advertising contributions have been received and election advertising costs incurred, all required disclosures must still be filed. All the funds in the election advertising account must be dealt with in accordance of the LAEA. So there's some restrictions as well, just in terms of restrictions on the TPA's name when registering. So a TPA will not be registered if it resembles the name of a registered TPA, an existing TPA. It resembles the name or nickname of a candidate active in Calgary or anywhere in the province, and as well whether it resembles the name of a registered TPA whose registration was cancelled or changed since the last election. So just some notes around the name restrictions. Okay, next slide. So in Alberta, I was talking about in the earlier slide, the election commissioner. The election commissioner has the authority to investigate violations or potential violations of Part 8 of the LAEA regarding third-party advertising. So it's all aspects of Part 8. The election commissioner is also the chief electoral officer for the province. The election commissioner has the powers of a commissioner under the Public Inquiries Act. So that means that they can command and require documents to be produced. Okay, the LEA requires a local jurisdiction returning officer, that is Elections Calgary, or the provincial registrar to refer any complaint or allegation or any act or omission that may constitute a violation of Part 8 of the LEA to the election commissioner within a reasonable period of time. The election commissioner's office is complaint driven, but may also undertake their own investigations. So a complainant, when a complainant is filing a complaint, they're required to provide their name, address, telephone number, and email address. It's important to note that no anonymous complaints will be accepted. The complaint should be accompanied by a factual description of matters related to the concern, including the events, dates, individuals involved, circumstances, and the action or inaction that the complainant believes may be an offense. The complaint can also be accompanied by relevant documents. The election commissioner's office is focused on compliance with enforcement used as last resort. The LEA provides authority for the election commissioner to issue administrative penalties of up to $10,000 for individuals and up to $100,000 for unions, organizations, and corporations for offenses under Part 8 of the LEA. The Election Commissioner's Office encourages questions regarding TPA compliance, and they may be reached at complaints@elections.ab.ca. So that concludes my presentation, and I will now hand it back over to Pooja to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. So if you haven't had an opportunity to post a question in the chat or don't see your question listed, we'll keep the session open for a few more minutes to allow for that. You may also choose to submit a question by email to elections@calgary.ca. As I mentioned, we will post answers to your questions on the Elections Calgary website within 2 weeks. Today's presentation will be posted online by the end of the week. And if you would like to receive notice when answers are posted, please sign up for the Elections Calgary e-newsletter, which you can access on the homepage at www.electionscalgary.ca. Then you click on e-newsletter sign up on the homepage and choose candidates and third-party advertisers. So I'll just leave it open for a couple more minutes. We have ample time here.